some reason, people seem to have a tendency to rant and rave on about how bad some of the games in the youth were, which is fair enough. But you see, I think they're missing a point somewhere in the process. You see, just like bad B-movies, there is a niche market and even a fan base, if you will, for bad games. And I think we actually need to have a bunch of bad games to balance out all the good games, so the good games would feel better. And I happen to be one of those people who actually enjoy a bad game every now and then. But you see, there are different kinds of badness to go on about. There are bad games that are just plain horrible. There are bad games that are mediocre and have absolutely nothing to speak for themselves. And there are bad games that are somehow funny and even enjoyable in the process. So, in honor of the 50th episode of my Nostalgia Games, I decided to go through a bunch of bad games on the Commodore 64. But in the process of making this episode, I realized that I might have to increase the number of games for each episode, at least for these platforms that I know best. Because otherwise I will be doing this series for 10 years or something. So, from now on, I'll be including 10 games for each of these better known machines, at least for me. So, here are 10 bad games for the Commodore 64. Enjoy.
We start with Tom from Kingsoft, also published as Tom Thumb by Anurag. Tom was written by the Commodore 16 legend Uda Gertz, and he's responsible for all 3 versions of Tom, all of which were released on different Commodore machines, and all of which are notably different from each other. I wrote a comparison of them some years ago, so you can find a link to the article in the video description. The Commodore 64 version of Tom is one of the worst gaming experiences you could ever come across on the platform, but it is also one of the earliest examples of multi-directional platformers, which explains the unsophisticated scrolling and jumping mechanics. At the time though, this was state of the art, and as it happens, multi-directional platforms didn't really get fashionable until closer to the end of the 80s, so you could say Tom was properly ahead of its time. I came across this game a year or two before I had my own C64, as I got to test out some of my friends and relatives' C64s with their game collections. One such C64 owner had a good collection of games from Anurag and Interceptor Software, and Tom happened to be one of the originals, which now seems like an odd thing since it's a fairly obscure item to have in a C64 game collection. But Tom certainly made a lasting impression for more wrong reasons than right ones, yet it remains a nostalgia trip game for me because of that. Another one of my childhood friends had more of an Ocean Software-based C64 game collection, and one of the most haunting experiences from that collection was undoubtedly Miami Vice, which to this day doesn't make much sense. Most of the time sacrificed for this game had to do with the absolutely fantastic rendition of Jan Hammer's themes from the TV series, as adapted by Martin Galway. It was fun for the first 10 minutes trying to figure out how to control the car that's supposed to be a 1972 Ferrari 365 Daytona Spider. Once you got yourself comfortable with the car, then you got to figure out how to enter buildings, find shortcuts, and hopefully perform investigations. Because of lacking language skills at the time, none of us ever got anywhere in the game, and now that I finally have the original in my possession, the instructions still don't make that much of sense. Shortly put, Miami Vice the game doesn't have much going on for it anymore except for the nostalgia. And I was never even that big a fan of the TV show, so the connection is fleeting at best. But it's always a nice blast from the past to listen to Galway's superb soundtrack and drive around the concrete jungle. Football has never been in my range of interest, but I love cheap imitations of football. My earliest memory of a football game on the C64 is World Cup 2 from Arctic Computing, and I've had this game as an original almost since from the earliest days of my C64 ownership. Now, some of you may have heard of World Cup Carnival Mexico '86 from US Gold, which has been cited to be the worst football game of all time, and practically ruined US Gold's reputation henceforth. Well, that game is nothing more than World Cup 2 with slight modifications to graphics, and perhaps the bigger reason for calling Mexico '86 even worse is due to the £11.95 price tag when the original Arctic game was reportedly cheaper upon its original release. And Mexico '86 should have been a budget release by every imaginable logic, except for one. It was the first official FIFA licensed game, ever. I never had such a problem with either game. In fact, I barely even noticed the existence of Mexico '86, even though it did come across on one or two of my friend's turbo tape compilations. With Commodore's own International Soccer from 1983 still being the prominent choice for a football game on the C64, and Ocean's C64 version of Matchday being a severe disappointment, it just felt like all football games were made from the same cloth. World Cup 2 had the advantage of being at least a bit funny, when the playability was never much to mention in any of the football games. Until Sensible Soccer on the Amiga, that is, but that's another story for another episode. A game that you don't hear often mentioned in the context of Indiana Jones is this little horrid beast called Indiana Jones in the Lost Kingdom. Obviously, it's not directly related to any of the movies, but it is said to have taken some inspiration from the second movie, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. This was another game from my early acquisition of used C64 tapes, along with the aforementioned World Cup 2. And for some reason I found myself coming back to it every now and then, even though it made little sense and played worse than most other games in my collection. Lost Kingdom acts like a puzzle game through means of badly programmed platforming, and I still have no clear idea what the game's purpose is, probably because my used tape came without a manual leaflet included, and I haven't bothered to check online. Anyway, you go through unmarked doors to find yourself in places that are pretty much unfathomable at first, but there's always something logical you need to do, either with differently colored balls or numbers or whatever. Sometimes the terrain is kind of iffy, and sometimes Indy keeps falling through the ground as if he's standing on quicksand. You are equipped with a cane and a whip, so you can fend off most of the pests with reasonable success, but fighting them makes Indy's balance more uncertain. Because of its mysterious nature, I still like to revisit Lost Kingdom every once in a while, even though it always leaves me frustrated and slightly angry at the game's developers for making an Indiana Jones game so bad that it's more of a joke than a serious game. Back to the collection I mentioned in the context of the first game in this episode, there was a game from Interceptor Software that I never quite could get my head around back in the day, and that was Big Ben. I mean, when you hear the name Big Ben, the first thing you think of is the Elizabeth Tower, as it's officially called. When you play the game, it doesn't come readily apparent what the title is all about, because it's a messy platformer in which you need to collect coins and avoid getting hit by practically everything. The game's back cover tells you a backstory about an evil wizard who has kidnapped your friend, who will only be released if you ring the Big Ben's bell. The tunnel leading to Big Ben can only be opened by collecting 30 coins. Well, shouldn't be too difficult, but it requires so much precision and luck, not to mention repetition to get your head around all the quirks in the game, that it's more than a bit frustrating. Interceptor was infamous for these kinds of games that would have a nice presentation with the cover art and a good loading screen with music, but the game itself would more often than not be a bit of a disaster. Regardless of that, I've got fond memories of them, and Big Ben was one of the first games I ever saw and played from Interceptor. One of the first games I ever saw on the C64 but didn't get to actually play until closer to the 2000s was this odd little Moon Patrol variant called Beach Buggy Simulator. This was one of the games released under Telecom Soft's short-lived budget label Silverbird in 1988, and one of 4 simulator-titled non-simulator games from Silverbird. I have a very solid suspicion of why this game lodged itself into my memory in the first place, and that is the idea of a beach buggy game. Ever since seeing the fighting comedy classic Watch Out, We're Mad with Bud Spencer and Terence Hill from 1974, which I probably saw even before I knew anything about computers, I have been obsessed about beach buggies to some extent. Just seeing the title of this game must have latched this bit of nonsense onto that obsession, even though there are no proper beach buggies in the game, nor does it feel anything like a simulator of any sort, not to mention a driving game as such. It is at least a racing game, since you'll be racing a red car against time through sand dunes, or something resembling such things, and you need to jump over obstacles and shoot small helicopters while at it. There's nothing particularly interesting about this game, but it is a funny little jab at Codemaster's similarly titled non-simulators from the late 80s, and I like it just for the stupidity of it. Another one from my early collection is a game from Ultimate Play the Game, which I got to know well on the ZX Spectrum from their classics. Their C64 offerings were not nearly as spectacular, but they were memorable in other, less flattering ways. Entombed is the second game from the C64 exclusive isometric adventure series starring Sir Arthur Pendragon, designed and written by Dave and Bob Thomas, and it was the first from the series that I got to play since it was included in a compilation called They Sold a Million 2. Oddly, this was not the worst game on the compilation, that would be Match Day, but the less said about that one the better. What always annoyed me about Entombed, and really all of the Pendragon games, was the way you were constantly being attacked by respawning things that you can't really dodge or even attack properly, since your only defense is a whip. Your only mission is to find a way out of the Egyptian tomb, which is stupidly difficult to get around due to the way the hallways are connected and displayed. At least you don't actually need to collect items to get out of the tomb, which is basically the biggest difference to the other Pendragon games. Entombed is a game with good intentions, but it falls horribly flat in execution. With a little help from a map and other clues, you might get somewhere in it, but I have to applaud anyone who is able to call it enjoyable. Despite my antagonistic attitude towards Entombed, I still play it once every few years. Nostalgia is a weird thing. Now here's a game that I'm pretty sure most people know it by its unofficial Snoopy variation, but it was, as far as anyone knows, officially only ever released as Johnny by Radarsoft in 1984. It's one of those so bad it's good type games, and here the cheapness factor goes up to at least 11. There's nothing more to this but walk through 20 screens and jump through various types of obstacles, holes in the ground, laser beams, invisible bits and what have you. After completing the 20 screens, the game becomes faster, but there's no relative change in speed. The graphics are super primitive, the music and sound effects perhaps even more so. And as with many early C64 game programmers, there's a clear lack of musical knowledge to have the single-tone music, which is Scott Joplin's massively overutilized ragtime classic The Entertainer, play in correct rhythm. But it all adds to the charm of this old thing, and I admit I've played this more as Snoopy than many of the bigger C64 classic because of its cheapness and simplicity. Good for a laugh, and as such holds its power surprisingly well after all these years. Mastertronic released a whole bunch of abominations in their years, particularly in their early days, but there's one from 1987 that I tend to revisit quite a lot, even though it's considered a bit of a mess. It's a post-apocalyptic driving game called The Last V8, and most people remember it by its bad controls and the synthesized speech.
V8, return to the base immediately.
Unlike most racing games, this car is driven by pointing the joystick into the direction that you're going towards on the screen, not the relative direction of the car. In other words, pull the joystick left to move left faster and pull right to use the brakes before the car turns 180 degrees and starts moving right. The acceleration and braking are also kind of slow, so you really need to learn how the car reacts to your directions before you can make any progress. Usually the first dozen attempts end up in a ditch. Crashing also results in a long explosion and a bit of music before the game recognizes your attempt at restarting the game, and the speech always comes when you begin a new level. Very frustrating and time-consuming, but it's one of those things that make the last V8 so memorable. Happily, there are only 2 levels in the last V8, so there's a good chance you'll get through it eventually. At least if you learn the least hazardous route in level 2. I have only ever managed to beat the game once, and that was when I did a comparison of it some years ago. Link below if you're interested. If you happen to own a Commodore 128, the game has a 3rd level that actually starts the game to make things a bit more interesting. But knowing the rest of the game's quality, it's not much of an incentive to hunt it down, is it? Anyway, it's a classic example of alternative game design gone wrong, but it's surprisingly fun once you get the hang of it. Finally, let's end this episode with a game I know most C64 gamers out there hate with a passion. It's Cobra from Ocean Software 1986. It's another game I wrote a comparison of many years ago, so yeah, one more link below in the video description if you feel like reading. The most frustrating thing about Cobra is not its bugs, although they also play a big part in ruining this game, but rather its unpredictability. There's just as much of a chance ever getting through this game as with the last V8, but this time the chance is more about luck than skills. Cobra on the C64 only has 3 levels, and unlike most movie tie-in games from Ocean, all 3 levels play pretty much exactly the same. It's just left to right walking, jumping and shooting, occasionally collecting a weapon or a hamburger to replenish your health or get an extra life, depending on your energy status. Level 1 starts with Cobra driving to one of the streets you're gonna start walking, and automatically taking a few steps before you're even able to control him. You start with no weapons, but there's a high probability that you'll be attacked by either a motorcycle or some lightning-fast enemy, either from the front or behind. You'll never know because it's random. If it's a motorcycle, you're gonna die instantly, unless you have lightning reflexes and are somehow magically able to jump over it, which you usually aren't. You have to reach the other end of the screen to have some sort of a platform to jump on, and because Lieutenant Cobretti walks so slowly here, there's a good chance you'll get killed by a bomb in a baby carriage or some other maniac on the way before you reach the first platform. But once you get lucky enough to get the game going, it's pretty simple, as long as you remember not to move after killing some axe-wielding maniac, because they will also move for a bit after you've killed them, and they're still able to kill you while blinking through their cheap death animation. I have actually completed Cobra a few times a long time ago, but nowadays I don't really have the patience to play it more than maybe once or twice when I make the mistake of loading it up. But nostalgia is, once again, a weird thing, and that's what makes me load it up every now and then. At least the C64 Cobra has a nice rendition of a tune from the movie soundtrack, which wasn't even featured in the final cut of the film, which is reason enough to load the game.